Welcome to Brain Ponderings, conversations with scientists at the forefront of brain research. My guest today is Anna Borghi. She's an associate professor of psychology at Sapienza University of Rome, and also has an appointment there in the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technology. She's done a lot of work trying to understand how the brain organizes information and processes it. And today I'm going to have her talk about three areas which are not mutually exclusive that she's worked on. They're kind of connected. Embodied cognition, inner speech, that is talking to ourselves, and abstract concepts. So welcome, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here.
Now, when during your life did you get interested in the brain and how it works?
Yeah, I started to get interested in psychology and cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience overall during my first degree, because I had my first degree is in philosophy, and I was interested in memory and conceptual representation since then. So then I switched to psychology and I did my PhD in psychology. That is the reason why I started to be interested in that. Yeah.
Okay, and that was in Bologna?
Yes, I did my PhD in Bologna, and also I had my previous degree in philosophy in Bologna. And then I moved to Sapienza University of Rome, where now I'm full professor since a few months.
Oh, you're full. Okay, congratulations.
Thank you, since December. I moved to Sapienza University of Rome in 2017.
Okay. Yes. And I see also you were in the United States for a while after your PhD, did postdocs in Atlanta at Emory and then University of Wisconsin.
Yes, I collaborated during my PhD and after my PhD with Larry Barcelo, who's now in Glasgow. And he was a very important person for me because I learned a lot on conceptual representation, categorization, and I really consider him one of the most important persons of my life. And then I was for a period in Madison, Wisconsin, where I collaborated with Art Glenberg, who is also a very important person in the field of embodied cognition. And there also, I think I learned a lot. So yes, these are two very important persons for me.
I'm from Minnesota originally, so Wisconsin's neighbors. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Very close.
So maybe one way to start this conversation is to talk about brain development, because so we have a granddaughter now. She's just a little over a year old, and she isn't saying words really yet, but she's learned a lot of word associations in her mind. Like she knows, I'd say, a dozen different animals. I can say, go get the pig or go get the cow, and she knows that. So I don't know. I think one way to look at this is from development, right? Because it started out, you got to have some information coming in, and this gets to this embodied cognition.
Yes.
What is embodied cognition?
Yes. Embodied cognition is quite difficult to define because there are many definitions around and many people working on it. One of the, I started with working on it with Larry Barcelo at the very beginning of embodied cognition. Then it has become more fashionable, etc. So the idea is that the body, not only the brain, but also the body is crucial for our concepts. I studied embodied cognition in the area of semantic memory and concepts. So that our body, not only our body, our experiences overall are crucial for developing our concept. And now there are many different streams of embodied cognition. So there are many different views. One view is, I would say, more moderate, which is called, people typically use the label grounded cognition. So basically, the idea is that our cognitive activity is grounded in bodily experiences, but also experiences overall, so that the context is crucial for our cognition. And whereas there is another stronger view, which is more focused on body, on the role of body. So the idea is that our representations are anchored and constrained by our body, so to say.
And by body, do you mean our different sensory organs, our eyes, our ears, our, touch?
Yes.
And
exactly. So all the sensory modalities and also interoception. So also signals coming from inside the body. So exteroception and interoception.
And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because lower organisms, they, as far as we know, the only way they learn things is by, sensory input coming in and they learn some association between whatever, an object they're interacting with and that. But then how does language fit into this?
Yeah, I think as to your first point, I think it does a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. And indeed, people working in embodied and grounded cognition do not assume that there is a strong separation between lower level activities, such as perception, action, and higher level activities, such as those that were traditionally considered as higher level cognitive activities, like language, for example, or like conceptualization, etc. But there is a link. So the idea is that our language, for example, is grounded in sensory and motor experiences. And not only that, the newest views and most interesting in my view argue that not only language is grounded in sensory motor activities, but also that language impacts our sensory motor activities. So that influences the way in which we perceive, the way in which we act and interact with the objects and entities surrounding us. And so language would not only be grounded. So for example, if I hear a sentence like, I don't know, throws a stone, that doesn't really mean that my arm, my arm effector is activated, but also that that this impacts the way in which I perceive the world surrounding me.
Yeah. Now, a lot of sports, athletes, they'll, before an event, or maybe even in training, they just close their eyes and kind of visualize in their mind their movements and the sequence of what's happening, and that's clearly all happening without moving. But on the other hand, if they hadn't learned how to do the sport and perfect it, they wouldn't be able to, imagine those exact sequences in their mind, in their brain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very, I think, a very nice example. So we did some studies some years ago on affordances, so on how objects evoke motor information with climbers. And we started from an observation similar to the one you are mentioning. So we thought before climbing, a climber observes the wall and somehow simulates what he or she is going to do, how he or she is going to climb the wall. And so the idea is that you prepare, that there is this kind of simulation that you use, and this simulation helps you acting, so, and moving in the environment. And so that's a very important point. One other observation related to your point is that there is a very interesting literature in inner speech and especially self-talk. So there are a lot of coaches who teach, for example, athletes to talk to themselves in order to prepare themselves to act correctly or to act more precisely in the sport context. So I think that also in this area, language has an important impact, an important influence.
Yeah, and so we've done a lot of work on like fasting, food deprivation, and I've thought about this from an evolutionary perspective, with the notion being that food scarcity was a driver for brain evolution. And so animals in the wild, they have to go through an environment, and well, like if it's an herbivore, for example, they have to remember where they've gone and what they encountered, where certain whatever bushes with fruit and so on. And then I I was told this early on, don't anthropomorphize things. But on the other hand, I can't get away from the possibility that they're going over in their mind. They have to be, in a way, if they're going to be able to navigate in their environment what they've been through before and go where they've been before. They have to remember and recall where they've been, and kind of like these athletes, right? They're envisioning in their mind where they're going in the future. So I think,
yeah, exactly.
and then the language. So your idea then is that language is kind of the same thing, except with words rather than objects in the environment.
Yes, I think that there are two aspects in what you are saying. So this animal, or human animals at least, might simulate. So they simulate, and this simulation is composed by a sort of reenactment. So
Yeah.
you reenact previous actions you have done, say, with an object. So I have a glass here. So in order to grasp it, I might have reenacted my previous experiences with it. At the same time, these previous experiences help me predict what I can do and what else can do with the object, etc. And yes, we think that language plays an important role. It helps us grounding and predicting further action. So it helps us in this. And also, for example, in the case of sport, it might support our memory. For example, if we have to do a sequence of action, in a speech is certainly fundamental to keep in memory the sequence of action you have to perform. So it really supports us in our cognition.
Yeah, repetition is a way to, kind of solidify memories in the neural circuits. Now, so kind of language kind of amplifies our cognitive abilities. And you've also wrote about, which is related to this, words as social tools.
Yes, the idea of words as social tools is that words are not only instruments to communicate. They are certainly instruments to communicate, but they are more generally instruments to perform actions. So like you perform an action with a hammer or with an object, but you can also perform actions with words. So you can convince others, etc. And so the idea is that words are tools in many respects. So they are inner tools because you refine your cognitive abilities speaking to yourself. So this is the idea of inner tools. They are physical tools, so they help you perceive. So there is evidence showing that if I see something far away and I don't distinguish it well, but I hear the name of it, I can distinguish it earlier. So they are physical tools because they help us in our perception. And also they are social tools because they help us interact with others, not only as far as communication is concerned, but they also impact our relationship with the world surrounding us. This is basically the idea of words as tools. Many authors have used the notion of words as tools. So philosophers like Wittgenstein, also Andy Clark, many authors have used it. And I think it's really very important that it captures really well what words can help us to do.
Okay, so now get to how you actually, what methods do you use to study that? I mean, you start out in philosophy. So philosophy is, you're not doing experiments, you're just thinking, right? And so you're a psychologist and you have to come up with ways of like any scientist, testing your hypothesis. So how do you go about actually studying this?
Yes, it depends. So, for many years, I did many studies on affordances, using behavioral methods, but not only behavioral methods. So, for example, experiments in which participants were asked, for example, to process objects, and we measured, for example, response times. Or to process words related to objects. I can make some examples of experiments if you want. So basically, we measured response times and accuracy of participants observing objects, observing also figures of objects, or reading words. These are examples of methods we used. We used a lot of traditional methods to study words, like lexical decisions, for example, which means you are presented with the words and have to decide whether the word is belong to your native language or not. For example, to Italian, if the experiment was conducted in Italian. We use methods like, for example, property verification tasks. So we ask participants and measure response times and accuracy, whether a property is typically true of an object. We used a lot also feature production tasks. So, for example, in order to understand our conceptual representation, for example, I give you a word and I ask you to produce all the characteristics that are typically true of this word. And basically, the underlying assumption is that in the words you produce, from the words you produce, you can understand the conceptual representation underlying it. So these are examples of the behavioral methods we use. I also use kinematics methods, so measures of the movement, for example, acceleration and velocity, for example, in grasping objects, and also use some in collaboration, for example, EEG, fMRI methods, etc. So more neuroscientific methods, mostly in collaboration. And I use also mostly in collaboration some computational models, so neural networks. So we did some models also sometimes with robots, but that mostly in collaboration. I'm not specialized in that.
And are most of these studies in a lot of times at universities, right? There's a nice population of students, right? Is this mostly in students, and is it, do you know how one's educational status, well, if and or not, it influences the results? In other words, could an age group, so how do all these variables affect your results?
Okay, that's a very important point. So and I think it's an important point for all the area. So recently there is a debate on whether the population is mainly a population of Western educated societies, or whether you can use also participants of different societies. What we did is the following. I did some studies with children and studies on adults. So we somehow had we studied the developmental course, for example, of conceptual acquisition. So we did some studies on conceptual acquisition in children, in adults, typically university students. And now we are working also on older adults, so adults above 65. So we have currently a project on that. We mostly studied participants in Western societies. Sometimes because we are interested in languages, we did some comparative studies. So, for example, we did a study in which we compared the concept of gender in Italian population, Dutch population, and English population. Or we did some studies in which compared different languages. But the majority of studies were performed with the university students. And that's a limitation, I think.
Well, there's advantages and disadvantages. My lab did use mostly rats and mice, although I was involved in some human studies. And typically these animals are inbred, which means they have like the same genetic makeup. And, you know, we're using litter mates often, so it's like, you know, brothers and sisters from, they're all raised in the environment is controlled and things. So that can be good in the sense that it in general reduces the inter-subject variability, but it's bad in the sense that it's not a good reflection of the humans, where we're outbred, essentially, using terms we use for animals, and a lot of genetic variability. People have different environments, different family environments, and so on, experiences, and that makes it really hard, like for clinical trials. So I'm getting off the topic a little, but it's kind of relevant. So many times there'll be some intervention that has a statistically significant beneficial effect in an animal model of a disease. And then when that intervention is tried in humans, no clear effect. There could be a lot of explanations, but one important thing is in the animal studies, you can pick out like a 10% effect. Whereas in humans, there's so much variability that there could be some small effect, but it won't show up statistically.
Right. So yeah, I think the problem of variability is really important. So we tend to constrain variability, and that's an advantage. At the same time, I think you have to say, I found this result in this specific population. So in the population of university students of, I don't know, Italian universities. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work totally for you cannot assume that it works universally, that it reflects a universal process. So I think at least we have to admit this. But I think that my sense is that the sensitivity toward this aspect is growing, even though there are also practical problems.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult, for example, to collect samples of small scale populations or something like that. Whereas it's easier to collaborate with colleagues in other, I don't know, Western societies, etc. So Western, or not necessarily Western, but in other universities, in similar cultures, in industrialized cultures.
Yeah. I think for you, for what you're doing, though, you're looking at such kind of general global principles and phenomenon that, you know, I think it's very unlikely they're not going to apply to certain populations. I would be very surprised if they do, you know, particularly unless it's some, oh, yeah, I was going to ask you this. So oftentimes in human neuroscience studies looking at brain function, there's several things that have proved useful by accident. So someone has a brain injury that injures a certain part of the brain, and then you see that person has a problem, whatever, if it's a speech error, a speech. And so is there any kind of similar thing? Are there certain people that have a brain injury or something that they have an abnormality in their embodied cognition or inner speech or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many studies. For example, we didn't do anything specifically on patients, but there are many studies, for example, showing that as far as categorization is concerned, there are selective difficulties, for example, in processing artifacts. So artifacts like hammers or nails or screwdrivers, etc. In processing artifacts, if you have a lesion in the premotor areas, whereas you have more difficulty processing animals, for example, if you have a lesion in the you have lesions in the occipital areas.
Oh, interesting.
So there are distinctions like this. And there are also quite interesting studies pertaining, for example, food, because food can be considered an artifact, at least processed food, whereas it can also considered a natural object. So the results in that case are mixed. We have never worked directly on this point, but I think it's a very important point pertaining this literature on categorization.
And what about, we're visual, we use our vision a lot. Well, and hearing, what about people who are blind from birth or deaf, and how does that affect?
Yeah, that's I think an important debate recently, because one point is, according to embodied cognition, you would use other senses. Right. So your body, you in some ways integrate or solve the problem using other senses. But the point is not straightforward, because there is some recent evidence showing that the conceptual representation of blind people is quite similar, or also colorblind people is quite similar to that of people who don't experience any blindness. And there is a quite heated debate, because one point is, where does this knowledge come from? And one possibility is that it comes from language. So do you get this information through language, or you don't? And that is really, I think, a very heated issue and topic of debate. If you consider, so does language have the power to help you overcome, I don't know how to call it, difficulty or not? So that's, I leave the question open, because I think it is the evidence, there is contrasting evidence.
I think it makes sense that the language is the key. I had on one of my podcasts a long time ago, it was on echolocation. I had a scientist who studies bats at Hopkins, and then this man who's been blind since birth, and he's been able to use echolocation to navigate. And in general, the blind people, when you talk to them, that's normal conversation. You can't tell that they're blind by talking to them if you don't know they're blind. So that somehow language compensates for that loss and enables them to function, perfectly well.
Sure.
Society.
Sure. At this point on the role of language for us is particularly crucial, since we study abstract concepts. So we study a lot in the last years. One of the main focus are concepts like, I don't know, freedom, fantastic, or beauty. So these words that refer to concepts that do not refer to a single object. So it's not like glass, but they refer maybe to experiences, and to experiences that are very different for different people. I don't know, for me and for you, the experience of freedom can be different. And also we can have many different experiences that we categorize as freedom. And we think this is, studying this is really a challenge for embodied cognition. Because I think it's easier to, sorry.
Yeah, so, okay, let's go to abstract concepts then, and we'll finish with inner speech. So, abstract concepts. So, as abstract concepts are often like that, well, they're not specific, and they're kind of categorizing something, like friendship, for example. It's not a object, right? It's kind of a category of people you see and enjoy being with, and so on. So what are the relationships between kind of learned objects and then associations and abstract concepts?
Yeah, we think that in order to acquire abstract concepts, you need to be very flexible, because children, for example, are used to associate, so learn category of objects. It's easier for them to learn the category of glass than the category of freedom.
Yeah.
And because the exemplars of the category of glass are perceptually similar, whereas the exemplars of the category of freedom are very heterogeneous and various and different. And so we think that the acquisition process is really different. We think that the help of others, so the support of others, so the parents or the siblings or the teachers, etc. And so also the role of language and of social interaction is particularly important in order to acquire abstract concepts. And not because they are not grounded. We think they are grounded. So if we think of freedom, we think of experiences. But we have to put together experiences that are really very different. And so in this respect, we think that the help of others can be crucial. And so the social aspect is particularly important in this case. And so we think that studying abstract concepts is very important for embodied cognition, because it's easier to demonstrate that that if I see a glass, my hand is the hand motor system is activated, whereas it is more difficult to show that sensory motor experiences are activated when I read the word, I read or hear or process the word freedom.
Yeah.
We also do not think there is a dichotomy, so we do not think that there is a strict opposition, but that there are differences.
I see. Yeah, it's interesting. Language evolved over time, right? And at some point, somebody, I would assume, had to invent in their mind an abstract concept, and then a word to go with that concept. And so it kept building and building and building. So over time, there's more and more abstract concepts. And okay, so what about, how does imagination and creativity fit into this? Because when you think about abstract concepts, that seems to be closely related to.
Yeah, we think imagination plays a major role. So the idea of abstract concept is really that, okay, if you think of freedom, you suppose I activate the idea of running on the grass. But at the same time, it's not simply that. It is that together with a lot of emotions and inner experiences that come together with that. So it's not simply the action, and also the idea is that in the case of abstract concepts, we differ. People differ from each other much more, and so there is a lot of space for creativity, so to say, for creative interventions. We also think that because language is so important for abstract concepts in order to acquire them and to process them, we think, and we have some evidence showing that they differ more across languages. So earlier you said you study processes that are likely to be quite universal. I would say that in the case of I don't know, motor affordances, actions evoked by objects, we can say so. But in the case of abstract concept, I think that there is a lot of variability, and that the cultural differences have to be taken, cultural and linguistic differences have to be taken into account much more.
And with many abstract concepts, there seems to be more of like an emotional component to it. When you said freedom, then I think of, in my mind, just comparing someone who's in slavery to myself or you, where someone's free, and then things like love and friendship. Yeah, those, I don't know, I'm just picking ones out. Maybe that's not uniformly true. Maybe there's undoubtedly a lot of abstract concepts that don't have a emotional content.
Yes. Yes, there are also some proposals that, according to which the main characteristic of abstract concept is that they have this emotional content.
Okay.
The evidence, at least as I read it, shows that emotional content is important for abstract concept, but particularly for some kinds of abstract concepts. So for those that are more linked to mental states, to emotional states. And this evidence holds also cross-linguistically. There is evidence that emotional concepts evoke interoceptive and emotional aspects more than concrete concepts, for example, across different languages. And there is also evidence showing that in the case of abstract concepts, emotional aspects are important in order to learn them, to acquire them in children. At the same time, I tend to link these emotional aspects also with the importance of the social aspects in learning them.
Yeah.
So it's not only that they have this emotional flavor, but it's the fact that in order to acquire them, we need the support of others. So I link it very much with these social aspects.
Yeah. And then I guess non-emotional abstract things are like mathematics, numbers, that kind of, is that a good example?
Yes, that's a perfect example. So for example, if you analyze, we did also some studies, some databases in Italian, in which asked participants, for example, to rate according to various dimensions many words. So for example, they were presented with abstract words, and there were more than 400 abstract words, and they were asked to decide how abstract they were, how concrete they were, how much they needed other people in order to acquire them, how much they evoked interoception inner aspects, how much they evoked the five senses, how much they evoked social dimension, etc. So many ratings of this kind. And indeed, we found that we performed a multiple component analysis, and we found that there are different kinds of abstract concepts. One are emotional concepts, another are concepts related to the self and social and self. Others are very abstract concepts like philosophical or religious aspect, belief, religion, etc. And another kind of abstract concept are numerical and spatiotemporal concepts. So concepts like sum, like subtraction, like numbers, like also space and time. So and people typically evaluate these kind of concepts a little bit more concrete. They consider them abstract, but less than, so to say, religion. There are some studies that show that they are not so variable across cultures compared to more abstract concepts. And also, they evoke a little bit more sensory motor experiences compared to other more abstract concepts. And one interesting aspect for us related to the embodiment, we found across many studies with different tasks that abstract concepts typically evoke the mouth motor system, activate the mouth motor system. I explain it. It's kind of so. For example, if you have to decide whether a word is abstract or concrete, and in order to decide it, you have to use the microphone, and we record response times, or push a button with a hand. With abstract concept, you are typically faster if you respond with the mouth, whereas with concrete, if you respond with the hand. And we found this in our lab. In other labs, for example, in Pulver-Müller's lab, they found with fMRI that mental states, abstract concept, evoke more the face and mouth areas. We also have some ratings showing that in the case of abstract concept, the mouth is more activated. This happens. This does not happen much with numbers and with spatiotemporal aspects. So in that case, the hand seems to be more activated, likely because of finger counting. So we are used to count using the fingers. And so that's a peculiarity of these specific kind of abstract concepts that are abstract on one side, but different from other abstract concepts.
That kind of makes sense, like non-social things, you know, objects and things you point to or you touch, and social things, obviously, you communicate through verbal mechanism.
Right.
Okay, let's switch to inner speech, and then at the end, I'd like you to just kind of speculate. This is something that difference, you know, brains versus computers. Okay, but anyway, so inner speech, we all do this. I certainly do this, and when you write, right, it's kind of inner speech. You're writing the sentence in your mind, and the neural networks before you type it. So how do you study inner speech?
Yeah, studying inner speech is quite difficult because you have to rely on reports in some cases, and reports are not always reliable. So they are reliable to a certain extent. So it's obviously feasible, and there are many interesting methods. What we did is, so far, we used methods, for example, in which you interfere with inner speech. For example, we ask participants to process words and to disrupt their possible inner speech. We ask them to pronounce a syllable, for example, ba, 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 continuously. Okay. And this is a method that seems to interfere with inner speech. Okay, and so we see the behavioral effects of this. This is what we did. There are also many questionnaires. For example, I had some collaboration with Charles Ferninghow, who has, together with colleagues, they have designed a very interesting questionnaires that addresses the varieties of inner speech. So inner speech can be, for example, condensed. We might use very simple names, or it can be more extended, longer, etc. Or inner speech can be monologic. So I talk just to myself, or dialogic. And they also studied with fMRI some brain counterparts of this. Not easy. We haven't done it. I personally haven't collaborated to these brain imaging studies, but there are some studies showing this. One other method to study inner speech is to use questionnaires like this, or questions prompting people. So, for for example, asking people why they are performing other activities, interrupting them and asking them, what are you thinking in this moment? Are you using inner speech? Is your inner speech lively, etc. For example, there are many studies, especially on mind wandering, so in which people have to perform a very boring task. So, for example, they watch the screen and many images appear, and they have to decide when a circle appears. And the circle appears, I don't know, only 3% of the stimuli are circles. So they have to wait. And so their mind wanders, and sometimes they are prompted and I have to say what kind of speech they are using and if they are using inner speech. So they are sort of indirect methods, but I think they can capture it can capture this sort of inner speech, but it's not easy.
And then
and also the mouth activation is also important to determine the use of inner speech. So if you vocally repeat to yourself.
So with the fMRI studies, then was the result that the motor regions or premotor regions involved in speech were activated?
Yes, the different regions were activated depending on the kind of inner speech you use. For example, social inner speech activates areas different from monological inner speech. So that different motor areas are activated depending on the kind of inner speech. And another interesting questionnaire was designed by Gary Lupian and a colleague, in which they, and we are using it now, we are testing it in Italian now, but we have back translated, etc., in which they investigate differences among people, because there are some people who use extensively inner speech and some people who do not use inner speech at all. So there are some studies on these populations of people who do not use inner speech, who tend to think, for example, in images. And together with some colleagues, we did some computational studies, for example, on based on data from, for example, autistic population, because sometimes autistic people use less inner speech, although there is controversial evidence. And we did a computational model of this.
And okay, and with someone with damage to the speech areas of the brain, do they have problems writing?
Yes, they would.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And so this gets back to the embodied brain, embodied cognition model, right? Where you have to be able to have circuits that involved in movements or whatever activated.
Yes, here it's that there are heated debates, because there are some people arguing that, so I think embodied cognition, people from embodied cognition or grounded cognition have provided many evidence, a lot of evidence showing that the motor system is involved during language processing, during processing of affordances, so invitation to acts that the objects offer, etc. At the same time, the objection that other people make is that this might not depend, this might be a process that occurs a posteriori. So that is not necessary in order to comprehend, for example. But it's a cascade process that occurs later. So basically, it wouldn't be necessary in order to understand an action word that my motor system is activated but when I process an action word, then this might activate my motor system. But it's not crucial for the comprehension. And there is a debate. I think there is good evidence showing that showing also with some patients, showing that, for example, I don't know, people with the motor disease have more problems in processing action words. And there is also some evidence, for example, on with people who have Parkinson's disease, who might have difficulties processing action words. But the evidence is not always clear. There are sort of, so there was a very clear study in 2008 by Véronique Ballanger, but then there is another study providing counter evidence. So it's really debated. So the point is this activation of the motor system necessary or not? And so.
And so with artificial intelligence and these large language models, is there anything that we've talked about today that the current large language models can't do?
Yes, so yes, they can do a lot. They can do a lot, but my idea is that they do not do it as we do, so to say. So, but I think that the debate today is on large language models is important because it pertains the power of language. So somehow, to what extent can a huge amount of linguistic data allow you to perform some actions that we do perform? So the way they learn is clearly very different from that of humans. For example, think of ChatGPT or these models. They use huge amounts of data, and they can have success in some operations, not in others, but they can pass, for example, some university exams. So does this mean that we can learn uniquely on the basis of language, and that we do not need the embodied interaction with the word? I don't think this is the case, but I think it's an important issue to debate.
Yeah.
I heard once a very nice example pertaining the brain, which I'm not an expert of octopus, but I read and heard that octopus have a very sophisticated brain, which works, however, very differently from our brain.
Yeah.
And so the outcome might be, so we cannot simply based on the similarity in some output, we cannot say that the mechanism behind is the same. And I think it's a good example too.
Yeah, that is a good example. And another one is some birds like parrots and crows, and they're very intelligent. They can I had a podcast with an investigator who studied learning and social interactions, and they'll hide their food in certain places, and they won't hide it when another bird is looking at them. They're very good at recognizing individual human beings. They can solve problems that actually are like even a 4 or 5-year-old human can't solve. But their brains, if you look at their brains, the organization is very different. It's like a bunch of different collections of neurons, rather than this layered cerebral cortex.
Exactly. And large language models, they are typically, the training occurs through back propagation. So it's a different way to learn. So we are more active towards the environment, whereas that can be considered as a sort of passive way to acquire information. and then they are fine-tuned and encoded by humans, etc. So there is a fine-tuning process later, but
Yeah.
they are, so we have different ways. So it is possible that because they have all this data, but they can solve a problem similar to the ones we do solve. At the same time, there is a point. So these data are data from human language, so collected from humans. And they are much more in terms of quantity than the data we can process. So maybe we need a different shortcut. We need the body in order to interact and with the environment. But I think that the debate on large language models is really important for also for embodied and grounded cognition. So these areas.
For the computer based, that so they're, you know, the answers or decisions they make are, as with us, dependent on the information they have available. And I mean, kind of a first approximation, you'd say, well, the more data, the better. But on the other hand, what's the quality of the data and where is it coming from? And, you know, are the answers that they're generating really the best answers, or are they going to kind of lead people in the wrong direction? So I think it's a little bit, it's exciting, but it's potentially scary too, and in terms of where it goes.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think it's important that because there is this debate on the importance of language. So it's not, language is an experience in my view. It's not just word associations or something like that. So so the emergence of large language models, etc., has brought to the attention the importance not both of the bodily experience but also of linguistic experience. And I think that we use both kinds of experiences, and so I think it's important.
Yeah, earlier on you're mentioning that most of the studies in the areas you're working on are like in Western societies, and I don't know this. Are these like ChatGPT? Is that available also in Chinese and Japanese? And you know, because the language, there's variability in the language. I mean, objects is kind of uniform, but it seems like abstract concepts and stuff are a little different.
Yes, I agree. I think that one issue is, so I mentioned Western society, but mostly I intended industrialized society. So this includes also some Eastern societies. So compared to small scale society, for example, where maybe ways of thinking are different. But yes, I think that one other problem is that these models have to take into account linguistic differences. So you cannot use the same system for different languages because depending on the language we use, we think differently. There is evidence showing that, for example, in Italian, we have the word like blue. It's a single word. So we tend to think differently compared to English, for example. There are studies not on Italian, but on Russian and English, because maybe we perceive more the difference between light blue and blue, because we have a language, a specific word dedicated to it. So, so I think that also in the case of large language models, it's important that to take into account linguistic differences.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, Anna. Well, you know, I appreciate you taking the time for this. I enjoyed talking with you and meeting you, and I hope the viewers and listeners learned something. I will put in the description section links to your review articles on the things we've talked about today, and I guess people can find you on the internet now. It's easy to find. If they want to ask you something by email, they could shoot you an email.
Okay, I thank you so much. It was a great talking to you. Very interesting. So thank you so much for inviting me and for
Okay,
the
have a
chat.
good rest of the spring and summer over there in Rome.
Yeah, thank you so much. You too. You too.
Okay,
You
goodbye.
too. Ciao. Bye.